Okay, let's get underway. As usual, I want to thank the three groups that make this all possible. The Left Forum you've just heard about. The Judson Memorial Church in which you are sitting very kindly gives us this space every month. Very, very supportive, and we're very grateful to the church for believing in what we do and seeing this as part of its mission, which is not something that all that many other churches do. And so I think it's worth thanking them especially for their being willing to do that. And they've been doing it for quite a while. And the third group is Democracy at Work. We're the ones who actually produce all of this. Some of you have asked what else Democracy at Work does. It's the weekly radio program that I produce, and I know some of you listen to on WBAI. We just crossed this last week 50. We are now on 50 stations around the United States. That program is broadcast regularly every week on 50 stations. East Coast, West Coast, North and South. Some of you asked me, are you in the South? Yes, we're broadcast in Tampa, St. Petersburg, Florida, and Houston, Texas, and a whole variety of other places. We also produce this event and a whole host of other things. You can go to our website, democracyatwork.info, and there everything we do is on display, available to you 24/7. No charge, etc. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off. This is being videotaped and will be shown all around the world within the next 48 hours. We know that because the emails come from literally everywhere. It is an amazing testimony to what the internet makes possible. I also want to address a word to our viewers on video. That the folks here have kindly paid $10 to come in and do this and help us pay for the costs of all of this. If you're watching on the internet, you're on your honor to go to the donate page, use PayPal, send us $10 so that you get your part of the benefit by seeing it, but you also do your part to help make it all possible. Finally, I wanted to mention, because of the video that'll be shown everywhere, but in case any of you are traveling, part of what Democracy at Work does is send me around the country, and the interest in what we're doing and what we do here is literally overwhelming. We cannot handle it. So I'm leaving Friday to go to California. I have a speaking tour in California during the month of February. I'll be speaking in 6 different places. On the 5th and 6th of this month, Friday and Saturday, I speak at Occidental College in Los Angeles to 2 different sets of organizations, sponsored by the ACLU of Southern California in one case, by Occidental College in another, by the Armenian Society of Los Angeles, which is bringing me out there also. Just to give you an idea, on the 10th of February, I speak in the First Congregational Church of Berkeley, California. It's the largest church in the city of Berkeley. It is a benefit for KPFA, which is the WBAI radio equivalent in the Bay Area. On the 14th of February, I speak in the Sonoma Community Center. I will be sober, even though it's Sonoma and it's surrounded by wine. And then toward the end of the month, I speak in San Jose, California. And the very last day of February, I speak in a place called San Luis Obispo, which is in the middle of California. 6 speeches in 5 different parts of California, and that's not mentioning the media interviews I do before and after many of those things. Just give you an idea of what the interest is in this kind of work. So for those of you that are viewing this, you can go to our website, democracyatwork.info, and get all the details, the exact place and time of each of these talks, the topics, the titles, and all the rest. Okay, let's jump then in. And I know that sometimes, this is my way of starting today, I know that sometimes having to explain to you what's going on with capitalism can get you a little down. And I am aware of that, and I try to remind you that you shouldn't blame me, I'm just the messenger. So it gives me enormous pleasure to be able to open tonight by saying to you that there's really good news. Now you all know it, but I want to talk a little bit about it. Bernie Sanders did something absolutely extraordinary. In many ways, this candidacy of his is already a victory. It actually was a victory before Monday night's vote results were in. And it only got bigger when those vote results were counted. I've spent many years in my life working in the Democratic Party in the machines in big cities where the Democratic Party is strong. I know how that works. I've been part of it. I know how you get out the vote. I know the whole apparatus. The Clintons had spent the last 20 years building the machine that gets out the vote. They had the presidency, which is how you give out the goodies that gets people to work that machine. Those of you who've done this know what I'm talking about. Those of you who don't, it's a lot worse than you suspect. And that's the machine that delivers the vote. That's how these elections are organized. It has never had much to do with democracy. I hope that doesn't come as a shock to you. It's a vote-getting operation. The old slogan, vote early and vote often, is very serious. And I can assure you, if any of you are interested, I can give you my own experience. And there have been elections in which I voted hundreds of times. And I'm not alone, not even close, okay? So for Mr. Sanders, a person who carries the label socialist in a country like ours, to be able to come from what he was thought to be a 3 or 4% maximum candidate just a few months ago, to becoming the serious candidate he obviously is an astounding achievement. There's very little precedent in this country for what this is. The previous people who've been a little bit reformers, a little bit different from the conventional politics, McGovern, McCarthy, Jesse Jackson, did not have the stigma attached to them of socialist. It wouldn't have been possible at that time. They made that decision, and it's perfectly understandable why they didn't. What's hard to understand is that Sanders made a different decision. He wasn't going to walk away from the title. He was going to call himself a socialist, and he was going to look everybody in the face and say, you're wrong. It can be done in the United States, and now is the time. Most of his advisors, I do know this, most of his advisors were highly skeptical. There were big debates amongst his folks about whether he should do this or not, whether he just wasn't, that this just wasn't a country ready for what it is he represented. They made the decision, I mean, I'm not part of the inner circle, so I don't know the details. They made the decision to do it, and I am very confident in suggesting to you that they are almost as surprised as everybody else about how this has evolved. So I want to say a few words about it. First of all, and there's a lot of ways of getting at this, the New York Times, which is an establishment newspaper, heaven knows, endorsed for the Republicans a person who I'm not going to even mention since he got no votes. The New York Times, the establishment newspaper, recommended Mr. Kasich, I will mention his name, and he disappeared. And they endorsed Mrs. Clinton. And the majority of people, more than 50% of the people in Iowa, voted against her. She got 49 point whatever it was percent of the vote. So if you add the minuscule amount that the fellow who dropped out from Maryland got, then the majority of people didn't vote. The New York Times not doing well. They endorsed Christine Quinn. She came in third for mayor of New York. They don't like Mr. de Blasio. If you read the newspaper, you will have figured that out. They're not doing real well because they represent an establishment that is unable to control the situation. I'm going to have more to say about that as we go through the hour and a half today. But it's very important that their endorsement doesn't matter to huge numbers of the people in this culture. Number two, we live in a society that is unique in a number of ways, as you all know. But one of them is that we are like a bear coming out of hibernation. For the last 65 years, it has been an absolute taboo in the public and political life of this country to say something about socialism. You risked being considered a moron if you were lucky. and a subversive, traitor, evil spy if you were less lucky. You were terrible. Everything about you was terrible, and everything you stood for was tarred with a terrible brush that you allowed yourself to be either critical of capitalism or interested in socialism, and for most people, those were the same. It's America that treated its people to a repression of socialists and communists that was stunning in its effectiveness and unrelenting for 60 years. Before the Cold War, during the Cold War, and perhaps most impressively, since the Cold War is over, it still hardly stops. It's extraordinary. Why do I mention this to you, since you all know it? Because for a person to run for president after that 65 years and call himself a socialist, that's why people were so confident in predicting he'd go nowhere, that the candidacy would be some marginal, fringy event that wouldn't even be covered in the press. And you know what that means. It's like the press doesn't cover the Green Party candidates or the Socialist Party candidates from the older socialist parties and so on. Many of you don't even know when they're running in your own district. You encounter them for the first time when you go in to vote, if they aren't buried somewhere on the ballot where you can't find them, et cetera, et cetera. This is amazing what this fellow has done, and it's most amazing about what it tells you about the United States. And I don't want to overdo it, but then again, I don't want to underdo it. A taboo has been broken. The impossibility of a socialist standing up and saying, here, I'm a socialist, deal with it, is now real. That's what that Iowa vote. Iowa. No disrespect here, but Iowa. In November, I went to Ames, Iowa, and gave a talk in downtown Ames, Iowa. I say downtown because downtown, midtown, uptown, it all looked the same. It's a little place. It's where the university is. I had a really good time. There's a very wonderful radio station there that carries our program, which is part of why I went there. But Iowa is not a center of boiling radical politics, in case you had thought it might be. Not even close. Half of the people who went to the Democratic caucuses voted for a socialist. But an even more powerful number, for those of you that didn't see it, because they broke it down. What was the vote between Clinton and Sanders of people in the ages 17 to 29 years of age? You ready? 84% of them voted for Sanders, 14% voted for Clinton. If I were a leader of the Democratic Party, I'd be shaking in my boots. That's the future. Those are the young people. They're the ones who aren't going to die in the next 20 years. They're going to be around. They're the new up-and-coming, the leaders, the people finding their jobs, building their families, and all the rest. 84 to 50, that's not close. That's overwhelming. What does that mean? Where does that mean the country is going? 84% of young people were not scared by the term socialism. Not even a little. It rolled right off their back. That's new in the United States. That's absolutely new. Something very big has been going on in this country since the Occupy Wall Street movement in the autumn of 2011 that has changed people's minds. Anyone who now thinks that Occupy wasn't an important event because it only lasted a few months is making a terrible mistake. The impact of that was enormous because it taught the American people that there's a lot of us around. We aren't tiny. We aren't the little 3 people that are standing with a little sign about the Iraq War in the downtown neighborhood, and that you honk your horn as you go by and you feel kind of sorry for them because they seem so lonely out there by themselves. This is a mass movement, and that's what was demonstrated this week. It's stunning, and I cannot suggest to you how profound it is. By comparison, every European country, without exception, has had socialist parties for decades and communist parties for decades. the presence, the activity. They were frequently elected to all kinds of offices, local, middle, high. It didn't mean the end of those cultures. France, Holland, Denmark, Spain, Italy, they're all there. Go see, they're functioning. Pizza can be purchased, hotels can be found, your shoes can be fixed. The culture didn't die. We are the only place that expunged all of that, that made that a taboo you could not break through. So finally, the United States, politically, is growing up and entering into the rest of the world's recognition that there are a lot of people in the capitalist system who don't like it, who think we can do better. And those kind of people, sooner or later, get interested in socialism since it's a major alternative to capitalism. We're catching up. Nothing to be proud of where we've been, but it is to be proud that we're not there anymore. And that's what Mr. Sanders accomplished. And it's an amazing, in my judgment, obviously, positive event. The last thing I wanted to say about it are two things. One, that it's clear to me that this is not driven so much by the appeal and the attraction of socialism. It's driven by a distaste and a disaffection from capitalism. This is, and that has to be clear. We have to understand that. And that's understandable because the American people don't really know very much about socialism. It has been portrayed in such a childish way as the sum total of all evil that either people buy that stuff, which is sad, or they know enough that that isn't true, but then they don't know what it is. They just know the caricature that they've been presented with is sort of silly. I can tell you from countless talks I give around the country that when I explain, for example, that in France it is the law put on the books by the socialists in France that the minute any young person enters the labor market, when they finish high school or they finish college and they go out and get a job, it is the law that the employer must give them 5 weeks paid vacation. That's the law, as it is in most European countries. Some have a 4 weeks, some, it's a variety. But it's not America, is it? They all have a national health insurance. Part of my family is French, so I know my relatives, they have a health insurance that covers everything they basically need from the day they are born to the day they die. They don't worry about the financial aspects of illness. They just don't. It doesn't even occur to them. If you have more than one child in France, you get a subsidy from the government for each additional child to help you clothe them, feed them, educate them, and so forth and so on, and so forth and so on. To go to the university in France costs a lot, $300–400 a semester. Why? Because education is more important than a public park. You let people go to the public park to have a picnic or to play ball with their children when they feel like it. Because it's, well, what is it? It's healthy to have a recreational park near you, isn't it? Well, if it is, then explain, please, why it isn't useful to have a free education for your people. It's probably at least as useful, maybe even a touch more. Who knows? But they have all that. And that was all produced by socialists. And so popular is it, and so firm do the people hold on, that when socialists are voted out of office, which happens a lot too, and conservatives take over, they dare not touch it. Because if they do, they won't be in office much longer. I may have told you, one of the times I was visiting my family in Paris, there was a demonstration outside the house. And I see a demonstration, I'm in it, right? So I went outside and I joined and only asked about what it was about after I was marching down the street. And because my family is French, I speak French since I've been a kid, so I could find out what was going on. And it was a protest against the government's threat to reduce the subsidies for childcare, for daycare, for young children. France has a very elaborate program. From the time a child, an infant, a toddler or less, you can take them to daycare centers that are very, very cheap, maintained by the government and have a very high quality and all that. And the government was threatening not to get rid of them, but to lower the subsidy, and that was a problem for the churches and other community centers in which they were usually placed. So I noticed as I was marching that behind me was the Communist Party of the arrondissement, that's the French word for the ward in the city, the neighborhood. There was the Communist with a red flag. I mean, it's, you know, as an American, I'm marching down the street and there's a lot of people with red flags behind me and smiling and having a good time. And they were arm in arm with nuns. And an American who sees communists is already a little bit shaken. An American who sees communists arm in arm with nuns, that's either a funny joke, or, which it clearly wasn't, or it's something to inquire about. Well, it was the local Saint, whatever it was, parish, and the nuns on the parish were marching arm in arm with the communists, all of whom they knew because they're neighbors, in protest. The nuns didn't want this subsidy to be reduced. The communists didn't want the next day the government withdrew the bill. Couldn't possibly, you cannot, in France, Catholic country, you cannot survive something that the communists and the nuns are against. It's over. You can't get anywhere. And France survives. It's still the #1 destination for American tourists. When they go there, the food is wonderful, the artistic culture of the country is spectacular. Socialism hasn't seemed to be the end of civilization as so many Americans imagine it might be. All of that is going on in this revolution. You know, I was a little taken aback when I heard the Sanders people refer to what they're doing as a revolution. It's a, how should I say, a little bit exaggerated, let's say. And then I was reminded by one of my students of a very famous letter sent by John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist. In December of 1933, he sent a letter to the then newly installed President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. And I want to read you the first 2 sentences of the letter from Mr. Keynes to Mr. Roosevelt, very famous letter. You have made yourself the trustee for those in, this is Keynes writing to Roosevelt. You have made yourself the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition. It's 1933, it's the depths of the Great Depression. It's a scene like we have, but worse. You have made a trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by reasoned experiment within the framework of the existing social system. That's the first sentence. Mr. Roosevelt, you're the guy who's going to fix this within the framework of the social system that exists. Now the second sentence. If you fail, rational change will be gravely prejudiced throughout the world. Now here comes the best. Leaving orthodoxy and revolution to fight it out. Cruz and Sanders. It's amazing. Think about it. Orthodoxy and revolution when the system can't function anymore. He predicts it, then we watch it now. Okay. Another topic, but really, and you'll see it's in the same. People of Massachusetts, I want to congratulate them. They did something interesting in the last week or two. The Democratic Party, they call the seat of their government Beacon Hill. It's a hill in the middle of Boston, and so that's where they are. And they have a new bill that they're debating, and the Democrats, at least some of them, are pushing through. It's called a millionaire tax. I just want everyone in the United States who's watching, and all of you and in the world, to know this is going on. What is the millionaire tax? Everybody who earns over $1 million a year is going to have an additional 4% of that excess over $1 million taken by the state of Massachusetts from them. It is expected to provide an extra $2 billion a year to the coffers of the state of Massachusetts. Okay, so that's interesting. It's important for you to know that that kind of thing is going on. Now, even more interesting, a debate, of course, rages in the pages of the major newspaper. The most important newspaper in Massachusetts, called the Boston Globe, if you're not familiar. It's sort of the New York Times of New England, if you like. It's read all over Massachusetts, but all over New England, in fact. And they have a very conservative columnist named Meredith Warren. And she's angry. As she writes, "I'm no fan of hitting up rich people to redistribute wealth, but I've got another bone to pick with this bill." And then she doesn't spend any more time attacking this millionaire bill. She says, "I'm upset that we're giving a free pass to," I'm reading from her, "a free pass to another group of greater Boston residents with multi-billions of tax-free dollars at their disposal, and I mean private colleges and universities." Massachusetts has more of that than any other state in the Union. It has the Harvard and the MIT and the Wellesley and the Amherst and on and on and on. And this conservative lady says, we should tax them. I will read you again. "Harvard leads the list of largesse, touting a mind-boggling $37.6 billion in endowment funds. That's roughly equal to the total budget of the state of Massachusetts for a year." And then she reminds everybody. Sounds like me. In 2008, a plan to levy a 2.5% tax on endowments over $1 billion. That becomes real easy. About 5 places have an endowment over $1 billion, so it lets everybody else off the hook. Was proposed on Beacon Hill at the State House, but it was beaten back. It would have raised $1.5 billion a year. That's something we should think of now. A conservative columnist reacts to a tax on millionaires, which she doesn't like, by making sure we're all aware of another group of billionaires that ought to be taxed too. The conservatives are moving in a direction they probably don't want to admit. Probably this will be defeated. The power of places like Harvard and MIT and so forth in Massachusetts is legendary. Half or more of the state legislators are graduates of the very school they would now have to tax, and you can think about that. The notion that they should be not making a decision since they are somehow involved and have maybe a conflict of interest, fortunately doesn't occur to anybody. So maybe it'll occur to you. But I thought I would make you a comparison about 2 other kinds of education that are not funded the way these rich schools who pay no taxes on anything are. So the first here comes from a very important research group in Washington called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. If you've never looked at their website, CBPP, do it. CBPP, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Tons of very, very good economic analysis in the United States out of Washington. They did a study of what's happening to public higher education across the United States. And they go through each state. What has each state of the 50 states done in terms of funding colleges and universities? And remember, as I told you in the past, 3/4 of America's students in college and university go to public institutions. Higher education in this country is a public event. You know, a kind of socialists. Pushed by socialists, too. Okay. In 2015, they did a report. And the report looked at what has happened to funding of public higher education between the time the crisis hit, 2007 and 8, and 2014/15, the 14-15 academic year. Out of 50 states, 47 cut spending per student across those years. Since the great meltdown of 2008, 47 out of 50 states have cut the amount of money they give for public higher education. If you're interested in the 3 states that didn't cut it, they are Alaska, North Dakota, and Wyoming. A combined population of 14 people. Okay? No, that's an exaggeration, just metaphorically. The cuts were significant, therefore. Average state spending per student fell by $1,805, or roughly 20%. So the richest institutions in Massachusetts don't have to pay any taxes, so they can have their billions to do what they want to do. But the mass of people going to public schools, public universities and colleges have faced an increase. Average tuition increase over that period of time, $3,481. The cost of higher public education shifted onto the people and off of the states, making life much, much harder, which is, of course, why college students are racking up the debts they can't possibly pay back and all the rest that we talked about. One thing for schools for the rich and another thing for schools for everybody else. Second example of that, I believe happened today or yesterday. The Chicago school system. That is a very troubled school system. For those of you that may not remember, the last time they had to negotiate a contract in 2012, the Chicago public school teachers went out on strike, a very dramatic strike, a very bitter strike, and a strike they basically won. And so now what happened was Rahm Emanuel, one of the most popular mayors in recent Chicago history. That's an irony. That was an attempt at irony. He and his schools chancellor, Mr. Forrest Claypool, I kid you not, is threatening to cut $100 million from the budget. I think it was at our last meeting, it may have been on my radio show, I can't remember these things real well anymore. I explained that the teachers had a job action a couple weeks ago in Chicago because the conditions of the schools were so awful. Rats, falling building, I mean, real dilapidated, they haven't maintained it. So to cut the budget another $100 million will do. They're also proposing to increase the amount that teachers have to pay into their pension, not to increase the pension, just to increase the part they have to take out of their salaries to pay for it by another 7%. And this is in a school system that services 400,000 students, the Chicago public school system. So they're now fighting over how drastic the cuts will be to an already damaged school system because there isn't the money. What do you mean there isn't the money? Harvard has the money. But there's no political way in this culture to get the money from Harvard, which has so much, and take care of the mass of people. For the minority of rich people who go to Harvard, there can't be a punishment because the majority have to do without. Keep that in your mind as we go through the rest of today's material. But again, because the winds are changing, I can tell you not only about this, which is a disaster, but I can tell you that the people in Massachusetts are pushing to tax the rich. And they're doing it more than most other states. But here's an even more interesting story. Over the last several months, something has been going on in the labor movement in Quebec, in Canada. And that needs to be recognized and understood because it is dramatic and it is portentous in terms of what is going to happen. The public employee unions, doctors, teachers, public clerks, and so on, have formed what they call the Common Front, the Front Commun in French, and to deal with the liberal government of Premier Philippe Couillard is his name. And he came down after a stunning demonstration, some of you know, last fall by the students in Quebec who marched and had enormously powerful demonstrations. They had a series of rolling strikes culminating in a general strike of public employees on December 9th, this last December 9th. 400,000 workers stayed off, 400,000 workers stayed off the job and shut down most government services on December 9th. They were angry because the government was proposing a 3% wage hike over a 5-year contract. That means you'll have less real spending money at the end of 5 years than at the beginning, because if your wages go up 3% at a time when the cost of living is going up 1 to 2% a year, I mean, do the arithmetic, you're going to be behind. So they're proposing, as their opening debate, opening position in a negotiation, that you're going to lose this much. That's what they offer, a decline in your standard of living. They wanted to increase the retirement age to 62, it's currently 60, and they wanted to get a whole bunch of givebacks from the unions in working conditions. At the same time that's what they offered these tens of thousands of public employees, he did the following things. It's always good if the politician does this sort of thing, makes your job easier. He increased the salaries of doctors by 42%. There are a lot of doctors in the Liberal Party. He raised the salaries of ministers in the National Assembly by 31%, and he bailed out Quebec's aerospace manufacturer at a cost of $1.3 billion. The unions went ballistic, as you can imagine, having been told they have to take cuts, blah, 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 and these people get all that. And so they undertook these strikes, and the government backed down. The government has now increased the offer to 9.1% over 3 years, which is quite a boost from 3%, to increase the retirement age only to 61, not to 62, and no take-backs, no give-backs of the working conditions. And here's the most interesting. The different components of this common front, the teachers' union, the medical workers' union, the sewer workers' union, there's a lot of them, they are now debating whether to accept the revised, improved offer of the government. And the majority don't want to accept it because it's not enough. And that they're voting right now, so I can't tell you how this all works out. But there's a level of militancy, a level of determination, and a level of solidarity, right, not that far from here, that is something to think about. Now, fortunately, we don't see that kind of rowdy behavior here. But it's happening pretty close, and who knows, the gene for this sort of thing may travel across the border and infect us, with the exception of the Chicago School Teachers Union, which has been quite militant and looks like it's gearing up for it again. Finally, a few words about the Federal Reserve and banks. The reason I do this is that a number of you have asked me, both people viewing from the outside and those of you that come here, to talk about the Federal Reserve. And part of me wants to do it, and part of me is afraid that if I go into the intricacies of the Federal Reserve, snoring will begin. And I don't want to disturb those of you that are paying attention by having you cope with a person next to you who's drooling on your shirt, right? So I've been hesitant to do it, but I'm going to try a little bit, just because we don't have that much time, a little bit, in the hopes of clearing up at least some confusions about this. Money has always been a difficult topic. All of us grow up in this culture having very complicated feelings about money, consciously complicated and even much more unconsciously really complicated. We love it too much, we hate it too much, we do both at the same time. It's a mess, as it must be in our society. So money is a complicated matter, but it is of course what makes the world go round. Try to imagine your economic life without money. I mean, you go to work to get it, and then you spend it in order to acquire all the goods and services you want. Money is everywhere, an integral part of your life, and most of your basic decisions are shaped, at least in part, by your attitude towards your relationship to the money you either have or don't have or don't want, etc. So first of all, what is it? And how does it come to be? Here's a lot of confusion. The bulk of the money in our society, and by money I simply mean a piece of paper which has a magical quality. You take this piece of paper and you give it to another person, and they give you something you want. You want a haircut. You want an egg. You want a software program. You want a massage. And this is marvelous. A human being creates this thing for you, this good or this service, And you just give them a piece of paper. What is this about? And you really have to kind of be a child to understand this. If you try to be very sophisticated, you get all confused here because it isn't complicated. All right, what is the kind of paper that does most business in this country? It's nowadays either a check that you write. There you go into a store, you write a check, boom. It's a piece of paper, you give it to someone, they give you a shirt. Or you give them, because it's a little bit modern now, you give them a piece of plastic, which when they run it through a machine, moves a lot of pieces of paper around, but the end result is the same. You get the massage. You give the plastic, they run it through the machine, papers start moving, you don't see them, but at the end of the month you get a piece of paper, it reminds you of what all happened here. It's paper. So the bulk of the money is created by banks. It's the bank that lets you write a check, and it's the bank that lets you use that piece of plastic. It's the bank that sends you that bill at the end of the month. So money is created by banks. Now, why do they do that, the banks? Well, most of the money that they create is in the form of a loan. Here things get really excited. The bank gives you a loan. It creates money and gives you a loan. And the beauty of that for the bank is it doesn't do that because it likes you. It does it because it's going to get back more from you than it gives you. It's going to give you $100. You got to give it 105 by the end of the year. $100 back plus the interest. So the banks make their money by creating the money, lending it to you, and getting back more than they gave it to you. This is very exciting. If you're a banker, you can get carried away with this. We know that because in the history of banking, bankers always do get carried away with it. They never have otherwise. They get so excited. Wait a minute, when they figure out what it is they got here, well, we'll be richer the more loans we give. So let's go get everybody who isn't certifiably dead and get a loan going with them. Because we're going to get back more. And we can even afford to throw it at some people who won't pay us back. Because there'll be enough who do that it kind of works out. And so banks have always lent, you can see the logic here, to people who couldn't pay it back. There's no limit on where the banks will go to lend, because that's where their income comes from. So they lend, and they push. They push loans. You kind of notice that? The 800 little invitations to have a credit card that come to your mailbox? You notice that? They're pushing money on you. They're always doing that. And here comes then the second little dilemma. Banks are also a place where you keep your money. That is, if you have some money, you take it to the bank and you deposit it. You ask them to hold it for you until you need it, which they're happy to do because while they're holding it for you, they lend it to somebody else and make money lending your money to somebody else. You can see how exciting this is. So they can either print it themselves, create it out of nothing. This is, I know, hard for you. Banks create it out of nothing. You go to a bank and you say, I'd like a loan. Here's what they do. They set up an account for you. You're John. They set up an account and they say, okay, as of tomorrow, you have $50,000 in the account. You go, really? Yes. How did you do that? I hit the 50,000 button on my machine. You got 50,000. And now you have to pay me interest for the period of time that you have. Go ahead, write checks, do whatever the hell you want. Use your credit card. That's it? That's how it works? Uh-huh. That's it. Now you can see there's a potential for abuse here. You can lend it, getting really excited, and you kind of have to lend it, because if you don't lend it, another bank will. And then they'll get the interest, and they'll become rich, and they'll be successful, and they'll have the new technology, and they'll have the new building on the corner, you know, the one right next to the 400 other buildings on that corner, all of which are banks, and you'll be the one left out. Nobody will go to you. You'll lose. So you have to give loans. You have to. Otherwise you die. In fact, you're always competing to look for somebody to give a loan to. So you give loans, and then they can't pay it back, and then you got a really scary problem. Because if they can't get the money paid back, then how are they going to give you the money you deposited? Because they lent that money to somebody, your money, and it isn't coming back. And then they call you up. This is the old days. They call you up and they say to you, John, we got some really bad news for you. You know that money you thought you had, that you gave us? We're really grateful, but we can't give it back to you. Maybe in a few weeks or months or years we'll get it back, and then we'll call you. Don't call us. We'll call you. When that happened, when people got the idea, oh my God, my deposits, if you're a company or an individual, they may not have the money to give me back what I gave them, then people would, I mean this literally, run to the bank. It's called a run on the banks. That's what it's called, and it comes from the spectacle which we used to see. Do you remember your American history? Some of you had a course. The bank panic of 1837. That's panic. That's the key word here. Run and panic. You understand banking. Periodically, people panic and run. Why do they run? Because they want to be the ones that get the money out before there isn't any anymore. The one who gets to the bank first might slither through the door, maybe hitting it with a hammer first, get through there, get their money out, so that their neighbor is told, sorry, you lose. This happens so often, so regularly, wiping out large numbers of people, that, this is going to come as a shock, people got angry at the banks and demanded that there be some kind of control, some kind of, don't let them just do this to us every few years. Everywhere in capitalism this happened. And so a government entity was set up called the central bank. So in France has the Bank of France, or England has the Bank of England. We actually had a Bank of the United States back in the beginning of the 19th century, but then with Andrew Jackson, things got messy and they got very corrupted, so we got rid of it. So we don't have a Bank of the United States. But in 1913, when another bunch of panics drove everybody crazy, we created our own central bank. But because of the bad history of the Bank of America, or the Bank of the United States, we didn't call it that. We called it this funny thing, the Federal Reserve System. Funny name, other countries don't do it, but you know, names are important in the United States. Remember, we don't have bus drivers, we have transportation engineers, all of that. So we have the Federal Reserve System. What is that? It divides the United States into 12 regions. New England is one region. They have a bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. The Middle States here has the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the country is divided into 12 regions, and in each place there's a Federal Reserve Bank, which is a government entity partly, and it is controlled by private bankers. They work together. It's a kind of a compromise, part public, part private, that is designed to limit the amount of shenanigans, fakery, dishonesty, excess that the banking system is so prone to. And clearly, it's been a resounding success. That's a joke. I just did a joke. It's not successful because we just came out of 2008 when the whole thing blew apart. So its ability to prevent is not very good, but it intervenes. So for example, after the excess, which it couldn't prevent, that led to the so-called subprime mortgage. What's a subprime mortgage problem? It's when the banks found people certifiably not yet dead and gave them a mortgage loan. They had no job, they had no conceivable way of paying any of this back, but they were given a loan because that's what banks do, they give loans. In the period from 2000 to 2008, a whole new profession grew in America called mortgage broker. What's that? That's a person who brings somebody who isn't dead yet to a bank and says, I got one. And the way the banks work is they gave you $1,000, a nice fee for bringing someone who would sign. Then there would be a very strange, very quick conversation in the bank office. The broker, it's your cousin Harry, brings in somebody he was drinking with all last week and says, see, he's got a pulse. He can sign his name. The banker then said, let me explain to you, and while Harry is nodding and weaving, the banker mumbles, at the end of which Harry signs. Great, says the bank. I just lent you $312,000. What does the bank do? Immediately, the bank takes that mortgage and sells it to somebody else. Because the bank, knowing exactly what your cousin Harry just did, knows that that will never be paid back. Because that guy drinks everything he earns and has no money. So you don't want to be stuck with a mortgage from someone like that, because you know where that goes. No. But you sell it to somebody, and the other person is an investor. Gee, how do you manage this? Because if the investor isn't a moron, he's not going to invest in that. He's going to ask a question. What did they do? The banks entered into a cozy relationship with something called rating agencies. Moody's, Standard & Poor, and I forget Fitch. Those are the three big rating companies in the world. What they do is they look at a security and they tell you how safe it is. They rate them. If it's very safe, it's called a AAA. You've heard about these things? AA, and it goes on down. So the banks went to these, said, I got the mortgages here. Don't you think they're wonderful? The agency said, are you kidding? I know, these people can't pay back. Well, you got a choice, the bank said. You either give me a AAA rating, or I go to your competitor, who will. Oh, I see. And they all got AAA ratings. Now you could go to a speculator and you could say, hey, this is a great investment. Whoa, AAA. The investors were still skeptical. So they demanded, I told you this would take a little longer. They demanded, that's not enough, a AAA. We want an insurance policy. We want the policy attached to that mortgage. Actually, they bundle them into groups of mortgages. We want an insurance policy, so if the deadbeats that you've lent money to can't pay the mortgage, they can't come up with the monthly, this insurance company will make the payment for them. It's insured. No problem, said the banks. And they invented something, you may have heard of it, called a credit default swap, CDS. This is basically a promise to cover if there's a default, if the mortgagee can't pay. If you can't pay your mortgage, then the insurance company will come in. These were written by, for example, the biggest insurance company in the world, AIG. It's an American International Group, biggest insurance company in the world, located up here in Manhattan on 3rd Avenue. And they wrote them because they sold them. The bank now had a mortgage. Stamped on it was AAA from the rating agency. The bank paid them a little something for that. And was an insurance company, which the bank bought, stapled it to the mortgage. So you would invest. You'd say, well, I can't lose from this. I'm going to get 7% for 30 years. It's very safe, AAA. And even if it isn't, I got an insurance policy. In 2008, predictably, millions of Americans couldn't pay their mortgages because the economy collapsed. They lost their jobs. How are they going to pay their mortgage? So all the investors ran to the insurance company and said, pay. And the insurance company says, sorry, we don't have the money. No one made sure that the insurance companies had enough money to pay off on the policies they had sold. Nobody made sure. I'm going to say that again. And so everything collapsed. I'm describing the capitalism in which you live. So that the next time you hear or you say to somebody, well, we don't have to worry about that, that's clearly under control, you don't understand. Nothing is under control. It's the job of the people who run this economy to escape each of the controls. In fact, they take their hat off as a corporate leader, become a government official to develop the controls which, when they go back into private industry, they know how to evade. That's what they've been doing for 250 years. But if you'd like to believe that it's now going to change, I have a bridge I can sell you also. The Federal Reserve failed to prevent the crisis Then, reeling from the failure it had, it then bailed them out. You know, here's how they did that. They went to the bank, they had no money, and they said, you do have money. How, said the bank. I just created it, said the Federal Reserve. Here's $1 trillion. That should help you. That's what they did. Trillions, quite a few trillions, were shoveled out to Citibank. All the private big banks were defunct. They were bankrupt. In the autumn of 2008, they were not functioning enterprises. They had panicky meetings in Lower Manhattan, a few blocks from here, trying to figure out what to do, and the answer was, the government has got to bail us out. They became overnight socialists. The government was to come in and take over and give them trillions of dollars, which the government did, since they are the government. This was easy. I'll return to the Federal Reserve in future meetings. Yes, sir?
A question about the Fed. The Fed, unlike the Treasury, is not part of the U.S. government. The Treasury is, the Fed is not. So the Fed prints money, but the Treasury is not allowed to print money.
That's right.
The Fed lends this money to the Treasury, which then the Treasury owes, has a debt to the Fed to pay them back and with a certain rate of interest. So isn't this a super scandal? If anyone should be printing money, shouldn't it be the Treasury?
Sure.
This is like the smoking on capitalism.
Well, careful. It used to be that governments printed money. It's famous all through history. People would get a gold coin that was printed by an emperor or a king, and then they'd, remember, you ever see that little, where the person puts the coin in their mouth and bites into it? You know why that is? Because it had this much gold on it, and underneath it was a piece of wood. And the government made a lot of money out of very little gold by, so you had to bite it to see whether it was real gold or a piece of wood with it. You know, it's the kind of thing you should be doing with your jewelry, in case you're not aware of it. Anyway, so governments used to print money. And that became a scandal too, because every time a government got into trouble, it just printed its way out of it. And so you didn't know whether the money you were holding would become worthless, because suddenly there'd be so much of it around that nobody would touch it. So to prevent that, you didn't let the government, the treasury of the president or the power, make the money. You made an independent part of the government that wouldn't be quite so pliable for what the leaders wanted. That's why we have a Federal Reserve that's a little bit independent. The president of the country names the head of the Federal Reserve, so it's kind of in the government, sort of, but it's also out because it has private bankers in it and it has an independence. That's supposed to make it less likely to abuse its situation. And it is, it's less likely. Not unlikely, just less likely. It is.
Private bank could get a profit?
Sure. Private bankers work very hard to make the Federal Reserve give them a profit. They now, for example, right now banks have a ton of money that they're not lending to any businesses or people. They got burnt in 2008, and they don't trust you and me. For good reason. They don't pay us enough to live, so they don't trust to loan us. It makes there's a logic to it. So they don't, what do they do with that money? They leave it in the Federal Reserve, which pays them an interest on it. But as I say, these are complicated issues. But the basic thing is the money supply is internal to our system. There's no gold standard. There's nobody standing outside the economy who makes sure it's all working. If you believe that, then we're in the realm of faith. There is nothing that controls this economy. There's nothing that makes sure it's all going to work out. I wish there were, but there isn't. And there never has been. This is a question of how the different parts interact, and it either works well or it doesn't. And believe me, the long history of capitalism gives us endless examples of when it works out badly. But let me hold on, because I'm going to run out of time, and I want to deal with some of the bigger issues that we promised to deal with today. The first one is global inequality. Well, since our last meeting, a very important report has been issued. The issuer was Oxfam. That's a very old, established, and very well-reputed agency in Great Britain. It's British. OXFAM, Oxfam. You can find it, Google it, you can find this report. It was issued during January last month. And it studied inequality in the world today. And those numbers that came out of that are so powerful that I really wanted to make sure tonight not to miss the chance to go over them with you. There are loads of numbers, a long report. I'm just going to pick two statistics since, for me, they tell the whole story. Statistic number one. They keep track of the richest individuals in the world. And they announced, because they've been watching this develop, that in 2015, last year, we reached a milestone. The 62 richest individuals, 62 people, names, addresses, 62 persons, the majority of whom are Americans, the 62 richest people, together, have more wealth than the bottom half of the population of this planet. How many people is that? 3.5 billion with a B. So the 62 richest individuals have more wealth than the 3.5 billion poorest. Words fail me, and I enjoy playing with words. What do you say? How do you have to go back to ancient pharaohs in Egypt to get something like this. You know, when millions of people are making rocks up to make the pyramids, and somebody is sitting there trying to figure out, you know, which slave to flog. What? Let's be real clear. The wealth of those 62 is not in the hands of that 3.5 billion. That's why those people die at a young age. That's why they have every kind of disease in the world. That's why their children don't get a decent education. This is causing death and destruction and injury and loss to millions of people who don't have enough. While 62 people have more wealth than the... I won't go on, I don't know how. Second statistic. For the first time in the record keeping of Oxfam, the 1% richest in the world, the 1%, have more wealth than the other 99%. It is. It is beyond words. And what do I want to say about it? Well, the mass of people don't have enough money. Why? Because there isn't enough? No. There is. They don't have enough wealth to solve their problem. Of course they do. They just don't have it because somebody else has it. When the city of Detroit and Flint got together to save money because they don't have enough to manage the water that people drink in Flint, Michigan, I assume you all saw that story. So they decided to use the water from the Flint River, a water that is toxic. If they had enough money in the budget, they could take steps to get rid of that toxicity, but they didn't. They didn't pay quite attention. And so they had this leaded water, which destroys the brains of children. And there are now thousands of children in Flint that are going to have mental troubles the rest of their life. The majority are African American, which brings in a whole nother hideousness to all of this. Wow. There's not enough money? There's not enough money for the education of the 47 states that cut the... What? Of course there's enough money. Of course there's enough wealth. Oxfam has told us where it is. 1% got it. You don't have it. And the only question is how long you're going to do without an education for yourself, an education for your neighbor, an educated workforce for you to live with, a proper water, a proper air, a proper education, a proper health. It's all available. It's a rich country. It's just not available for you. And that's only a question of how long you tolerate that. And the people at the top know it. They know it. And they're getting more and more nervous. Why are they getting nervous? Because they understand. I'm going to take you now back to the letter from Mr. Keynes to Mr. Roosevelt that I read to you before. This is from an article that appeared recently in Salon magazine. If you're interested in the reference, I will give it to you later. It's an electronic magazine you can get. Salon, SALON.com. It's very interesting. In 1938, when a recession happened in the middle of the Great Depression, conservative Democratic legislators urged severe cuts in public works and farm aid. President Roosevelt wrote in his diary, "If we do what these this is the president writing in his diary, if we do what these conservatives want, it will mean calling out the troops to preserve order. It might even mean a revolution or an attempted revolution." Anybody who says that the people at the top don't understand where they're going, they do. They may not be able to stop themselves, but they do. Good numbers of them do. And they're worried. They're worried a lot. Let me give you another example. Joseph Kennedy, in the 1930s, the millionaire father of the eventual president, John F. Kennedy, said during the Depression, quote, "In those days I felt and I said that I would be willing to part with half of what I had if I could be sure of keeping under law and order the other half." Kennedy, like many, although not all, of his elite colleagues, knew that capitalism had to be bridled if it was to survive. Now listen to this. This is a statement made by Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, that he made to Senator Joe McCarthy, the big anti-communist senator. Quote, talking to McCarthy, Kennedy says, "I knew in the 30s that big drastic changes had to be made in our economic system. I wanted Roosevelt in the White House for my own security." The one way that Bernie Sanders will become president of the United States if those people see in him the same game that they got Roosevelt to play. Watch for it. It's his only chance. And then we'll have to wonder what price he pays for being in that position. Second, capitalism's instability. I want to remind you about capitalism's instability. What does it mean? This is a system, and I've made this joke, I'm going to make it again because it usually gets at least a few laughs. Capitalism is a system that wobbles up and down. Every 4 to 7 years it has what sometimes is called a crisis, sometimes called a business cycle, sometimes called a downturn, a recession, a depression. We have a lot of words because we have this a lot of the time. Every now and then, one of these downturns is really bad, like the one in the 1930s or the one in 2008. But the system is very unstable. You don't know from one year to the next whether it's going to hit or not. And when it hits, you don't know whether it'll hit your industry and your job will be gone, or the job of your wife or your husband or your cousin or your mother or whatever. Very scary to live in that. So here comes the joke. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Because we're talking about the kind of roommate that eats the yogurt you bought and put in there, in the fridge, and then when you say something, looks at you as if there's something wrong with you. It's yogurt. I was hungry. What do you want me to do? I left you the little teaspoon stuck in the bottom with some cherry glop at the bottom. You can eat that. Or you would have demanded that your roommate get professional help. But you live in an economic system that is highly unstable, and you imagine that it was just like that. No, it's like the rain. It comes sometimes. It's just there. In the 1930s, a terrible one. 1929 wasn't done until 1941, 11 years. Now another one, 2008, and we're 8 years into that. We don't know if it'll last longer, or we don't know yet. Wow. The National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, is the official agency in this country that keeps track of these things. They measure and they declare when an economic downturn happens, when it's a recession, and so on. Between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of the new one in 2008, we had 11 more. 11 in that period. That's called an unstable economic situation. Two things about it before I tell you where this goes. First, every society that is capitalist is therefore confronted with a tremendous problem. Every worker is going to sooner or later be affected by this kind of a downturn because it hits this industry one time, that industry the other, this industry. If you don't do something to make it hit a particular group of people, the same people all the time, you're going to make all workers crazy as they worry whether this time it's going to be me, or next time it's going to be me, or next time it's going to be my cousin, or whatever. So all societies try to make the suffering happen to a particular group of people. Let me show you how the Europeans do it. The way the Europeans solved this problem was by immigrants who have funny names in Europe. Gastarbeiter, a guest worker. Arbeiter is a German word for worker. A guest worker. In France, they would bring people from North Africa across the Mediterranean. When the economy was okay, they brought them in to work. And then the middle of the economy turned down, 3, 4, 5 years. They pack them on a boat and send them back. Then you don't have to give them unemployment insurance. You don't have to give them any Social Security. You don't have to give them anything other than a cheap ticket on a leaky boat. Takes only a few hours. You're across. You're back in Morocco or Tunisia or Algeria. In the rest of Europe, you bring them from Turkey. You bring them from the Middle East. You bring them from the far. In England, you bring them from whatever's left of the British Empire. Jamaicans, Trinidadians, South Africans, Botswana people come to England. And then when you don't need them, chuck them. We had that here in the United States. Puerto Rican people played that role for quite a while. But we didn't need it quite so much because we have an in-house group that has played that role. Black people. The slaves or the ex-slaves. Last hired, first fired. That's another way of saying the victims of the ups and downs. When it's up, you get hired. But the minute it turns down, why? Because it could give then and sustain in the white population the illusion that that unemployment wasn't because of the system, but it was because something's wrong with those black people. They're losing their job because they're not working hard, or they're not this, or whatever you have. You could deflect the anger built up by an unstable system, not on the system that's unstable, but on its victims as if they're to blame. It's like blaming the woman who has a tight blouse for being attacked sexually, instead of understanding that there's a loose screw loose in the person who does such a thing. You blame the victim by finding something to make them the cause of what has happened to them. It's very powerful the way societies have adjusted to the instability of capitalism and the effort not to face it and recognize what the problem is. But why do I tell you this? Because of the history? No, interesting as that is. We are now looking, and it's very, very important, we are now looking at a high likelihood. No one can predict these things exactly, and I'm not suggesting I can any better than anybody else. But the growing consensus in the financial press is that this year, 2016, isn't going to be very good economically. That's a polite way of saying we're going to have an economic downturn and nobody knows how bad it'll be and how long it'll last. Why is that? And the answer is debt. Those of you who paid attention know that at the Davos World Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago, that got a lot of attention because it's an annual get-together of the biggest industrialists and economists and government finance ministers in the world. They have meetings in between skiing. Davos is a ski area in the Alps in Switzerland. But, you know, there's a great stress being a financier, and you have to relieve the stress by gliding into a tree every so often. Not often enough, but in any case. Here's what happened. The banks, remember, we talked about them, the banks lent all that money to people who couldn't pay it back for mortgages. And in 2008, that little lovely game collapsed as all the people couldn't pay it back. And then everybody who had invested in these mortgages went to the insurance companies to cash in on their credit default swaps. And that's why the government took over the AIG insurance company, because it had no money. So the government printed the money that paid off the insurance company, et cetera, et cetera. So we got into terrible trouble. And the economy collapsed. And the government got terrible, frightened. The economy's going to collapse. And a lot of people are going to get, here we go, angry at capitalism. Partly because it's what's hurting them, and partly because of a lot of funny people, sort of, you know, like me, who are running around saying, that's it, it's the capitalism. So you couldn't let that go. It's too dangerous. So not only did you bail out the banks, but you came up with another way. You couldn't get the banks to lend to the mass of people. They just got burnt. And the mass of people are now largely unemployed, with jobs that are much less secure, with many fewer benefits and much less income. So you're not going to boost the economy by lending back to the mass of people. The banks won't do that. It's too dangerous. Well, who will they lend to? What's the least dangerous thing that a bank can lend money to when it can't lend to average people? The answer here isn't hard to see. You lend to a government. So what we've had is a slow ebbing of the private debt, it's called, of individuals, and a tremendous increase in government debt. The banks are lending trillions to governments, which is why all over the place, governments that borrowed all this money are now discovering, we can't pay it back. It's the same thing. You lent crazily to individuals, they couldn't pay it back. Then you lent crazily to governments to bail out the results of having overlent to individuals, and now the governments can't pay back. That's why Detroit is bankrupt. It can't pay back the money it borrowed. If you're not paying attention, which you should be, you can watch right now the destruction of what's left of Puerto Rico because it can't pay. It owes $72 billion, and there's no way on this green earth that Puerto Rico can pay such a debt. The only mind-boggling question is, where does a poor island of 3.5 million people rack up a $72 billion debt? Well, that's the way this is handled. They can't. Corporations borrowed like crazy. Banks would lend to bigger corporations. They're having trouble. We go from one rolling crisis to another. The great fear is that governments and corporations will not be able to pay back during 2016, and that's going to provoke us into another crisis, and no one knows who's left to lend to. People can't do it, corporations can't do it, and the governments are now bankrupt. They can't. The Greek government is in an endless crisis. They can't pay. Neither can the Italian government, which is just a few months behind all of this. The Spanish government can't, and on and on. You live in a system that is out of control. And only vast amounts, and I'm going to use a technical term now, vast amounts of bullshit keep people with the idea that this is all working out somehow. It isn't. The people who run this society are going from one hysterical crisis to another. They don't show you that. It's sort of like Mrs. Clinton and Bill last Monday night talking about their great victory. They had just been handed the defeat of the century, but they understand the game, and victory and theater. Theater for folks that don't understand how this is to be understood. Last thing. A very important wind has changed in England. Very, very important. The Labour Party. That's the other party, not the Conservatives, the Labour Party, made a statement. The statement was made by the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and it was made toward the end of January, last month. And he outlines a change in the strategy of the British Labour Party. Here's what they said. In the past, we, as a socialist party, which the Labour Party described itself for much of its history as that, we were in favor of the government playing a much larger role in the economy. The government running the railroads, the government running the universities, the government doing a great deal, like the National Health Service in England and so forth. But we are changing our policy. I'm going to quote now. When it comes to the wider economy, labor should look elsewhere, not to the government for solutions. And instead, we should draw on the tradition of supporting workers' cooperatives. Whoa. That the new socialism of the Labour Party in England, and that's a big party. I mean, they've been in office often. They can win the next election, maybe. Not easy, but maybe. We are now going to use the power of the government, but to give socialism a new meaning, a new task, a new definition. Socialism is about changing the organization of enterprises, factories, offices, stores, from the top-down capitalist system of a few people at the top, the owners, the major shareholders, the board of directors, telling everybody else what to do. And we're not doing that. We're not socialists in the sense we're going to take that away from the private owner and unchanged give it to the government. So instead of a private capitalist sitting at the top, a government official sits at the top. No. That's what we used to do. We're not doing that anymore. That's not what socialism in the 21st century is going to mean. What is it going to mean? We are going to primarily, I'm going to read, support giving employees in companies which are about to be sold off. Companies about to be sold. Or companies about to be floated on the stock exchange. Workers are going to get the first option to purchase the company. And the government is going to help them do it, and the government is going to finance them to do it. The government is going to print the money and make the loan to the workers to take over. That means if an entrepreneur, an inventor, comes up with a new thing and makes a business and it's successful, and then that person reaches old age or loses interest and the business is now going to be passed on, it cannot be bought by another company. It cannot be. It cannot be made into a joint stock company that rich people buy and own. It can only, the first option will be given to the workers. It's a regularization of a transformation from a capitalist, top-down, hierarchical economic system in each enterprise to a system of worker cooperatives. This is an amazing change, and only because it is not understood is this buried in the media that don't understand what it means that a major political party in a major country in the world, Britain is small, but it's still an important player in the world economy, that their number 2 political party would make that commitment that entails changing what socialism and what their target policy is astounding. And it leaves a kind of challenge, is my last point for today for all of you. It leaves a challenge. And the challenge is put at the feet of Bernie Sanders. Because Bernie Sanders is still championing the old socialism. The socialism of the government coming in. The socialism of Scandinavia, Denmark he uses as the example. The socialism of the government playing a role. And I'm not saying for or against it, but that his image of socialism, or what he calls democratic socialism, he puts that adjective there, hasn't yet come to terms. But it took a step. If you read the economic platform of Bernie Sanders, down low, it's not the primary one, but down low there is a, we should support co-ops. It's in there. He has it. He doesn't give it the play that Mr. McDonnell in Britain does, or at least not yet. But these are more than straws in the wind. Socialism doesn't stay the same any more than anything else does. Socialism is changing. Socialists learned from what happened in the Soviet Union and China that if you have the government do all those things, you run a risk that that government becomes too powerful, too much, goes too far. Socialists aren't stupid. They reacted. Well, what does that mean? How do we deal with that problem? And the answer that is emerging as the dominant new answer is you make sure that the power rooted above all in the economy is grounded in the mass of people. And the best way to do that is to make the enterprise owned and operated by the people who work there. Not some tiny group that can make the government serve it, but the mass of people own and operate these enterprises. This is a new meaning and a new direction. And it will give socialists an enormous political advantage. Because what people who don't like socialism don't like is the old socialism. They're not even ready to hear what it might mean for each of you, each person in America, to be told what socialists are about is to change the workplace. You're not going to be a drone anymore. You're not going to come 9 to 5, 5 days a week, be told what to do, how to do, where to do, and then you go home and leave it behind. You're going to come to work, you're going to have a particular task, but you're part of the people who own and operate that enterprise. You're on the board of directors. How come? Because you work here. And everybody who works here is a democratic participant in making all the decisions. Wow. It's going to change your life. It's going to develop your character, your personality, your capabilities. Working is going to be an interesting thing, not a drudgery you have to go through to get the money you need to live. It's actually going to be something you look forward to doing because it's a development of yourself as a human being. That should always have been socialism's dream. It's now actually being realized in a concrete way. I have to get ready to go to California. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you very, very much.